are. And as I was saying, right, I said to you last week, and it is my intention to spend some time really probing the issue of the salience of the affordability issue in American politics, but also the question about whether or not that adequately or accurately frames things. And so, as I've said to you, I think this is extraordinarily important, not just because it has so much resonance with so many American voters, as we have seen now, I think, for three consecutive election cycles. If you frame issues in terms of an affordability crisis, voters are responsive to that framing. But it's not just that. I think that the deeper question is it an accurate framing? I spoke with you a little bit last week about vibe sessions and a economy that this may have more to do with sentiment than with the actual relationship between wages and costs of important goods in our economy. We'll eventually get into some of that data. And the issue then is, how do we respond to a widespread perception that there's an affordability crisis if perhaps that doesn't fully capture what is probably driving that perception? So that's just a little bit of a sense of where I propose to go, maybe in the second half of today's class. But before I get there, obviously, I think we are all focused on, welcome to 2026, the invasion, the military operation that occurred in the middle of the night, the early morning in Venezuela, the result of which is that Nicolás Maduro is now a prisoner on an American military vessel on the Iowa Jim, that there were helicopters and a lot of munitions dropped in various bases in Venezuela, preparatory to the special forces operation that apprehended Maduro and his wife, that one of the largest bases in Venezuela is now ablaze, and that we now have seen, I didn't get to see it all. I was doing other stuff this morning, but a news conference in which the president and the Secretary of State and the man we now call the Secretary of War gave us various accounts of what the mission is, and it appears that this mission is not a surgical mission to capture Maduro, but in the way that the president expressed it, the United States will now run Venezuela with, I'm sorry, and was moving fast, should be boots on the ground and military involvement as it pertains to oil, right? These are the president's words. And I will just say very quickly, I'll get into the details in a moment, but the question of whether or not Venezuela will accept U.S. ongoing military presence in their society, and if the government and the military of Venezuela rejects this, as I think they are quite likely to do, whether or not the United States would then mount a full-scale invasion of Venezuela, because I don't see any other way for the United States to run Venezuela if the vice president, who's just been sworn in as president, if the military, if the regime refuses to allow the United States a role in running a society. And I will be as clear as possible, right? This is what I would call 21st century imperial invasion, right? That this is an effort for the United States to basically say to Venezuela, and I think everybody who looks at this with just a little bit of focus recognizes that Nicolás Maduro is not a good leader, right? That he jails and tortures and kills his opposition within his own society, that his regime is highly corrupt. It may have done some quite popular socialist things and have some deep support within society as a result of nationalizing the oil reserves. We'll get into that in a moment, and redistributing resources. But there is rampant inflation, a failing economy, millions of refugees, ongoing internal repression, a clear repudiation of Maduro by the majority of the Venezuelan population in the most recent election, as far as we can tell. And so all of this amounts to, I think, a situation in which you might say this is a society with a bad leader. And then, as somebody pointed out to me today, you might point to the man on the left of the screen and say that it appears that he is so corrupt that he's made $4 billion in his first year as president, that he's a felon who has repeatedly violated the law. And by the way, let's not get into this game of who is more corrupt or worse. Let's just notice that there are many corrupt, repressive, lawless, ruthless leaders in the world today. And obviously, the United States is not going to invade and take out of power all of them. And not only that, in ways that we will get into, right? Pete Hegseth said in the news conference that the president wants or intends to dominate the Western Hemisphere, right? Are we next going to move on to Colombia and Cuba, right? I don't think that this is a realistic foreign policy. I think that this is premised on a kind of magical thinking, which says that once we've captured Maduro, the country is going to recognize the leadership within the regime, the interests that sustain that regime will recognize, the United States is serious and we have to get out of its way. Because, frankly, the cost to the United States of a protracted military campaign in Venezuela and the risk to the United States of regime collapse as opposed to regime change in Venezuela. In other words, Venezuela potentially becoming an anarchic or stateless society, that the result could very well be civil war or the destabilization and eventual collapse of governmental institutions which are already fragile in Venezuela, which rely on repression, which are unpopular, right? The likelihood that if the regime doesn't cooperate, the options for the United States to impose its will on Venezuela are limited, costly, and exceedingly dangerous, will embolden the regime to not cooperate with the United States, far from being intimidated into bowing to the will of the President of the United States. I suspect that the regime in Venezuela will be, more popular, because now they will be able to fashion themselves as the defenders of Venezuelan sovereignty, of Venezuelan autonomy, of Venezuelan territorial integrity. And by the way, I don't think Donald Trump did himself any favors by the insistent emphasis on the American interest in Venezuelan petroleum reserves. This really does look like early 20th century American imperialism in Latin and South America, where we were primarily interested in extractivism, in taking the resources from these countries in order to bolster our own wealth. And there's nothing quite like the threat of another society plundering your resources to produce a kind of nationalism which often rallies around the regime in power, right? So, yes, what was said today is, I think, profoundly bold and disturbing. That Donald Trump intends to run Venezuela with the military directly involved in reconstituting the infrastructure of oil extraction and refining. It does speak to the ambition, the grandiosity of this. This was not a targeted surgical strike to take out a single individual who was presented as a fugitive from American law, right? That's Marco Rubio's effort to frame this not as an act of war or an invasion, but instead as a law enforcement operation to rationalize the failure to seek congressional authorization for this. But having said that, he is directly undermined by what Donald Trump is saying, right? That we will have a occupation of this society, that the occupation will be led by the American military, and that its primary interest, its primary mission will be in reconstituting the Venezuelan petroleum extraction infrastructure in order to enrich it, both Venezuela and the United States, right? And so the idea that this is not likely to go down well with the Venezuelan regime or the Venezuelan people, I think makes this an exceedingly difficult thing to pull off successfully. I will not try to speculate terribly much on the details of what happened in Venezuela early this morning. I think we will have to wait for solid reporting. I don't fully take at its word this administration. And on the other hand, I do hope that soon enough we will have greater information. What I gather is that there was a concerted attack on this large military complex, Fuerte Tijuana, which is in Caracas, in the capital of Venezuela, close to the coast, that there were probably strikes from the guided missile destroyers and helicopters launched from various fighters in the area, as well as possibly from Puerto Rico. There has been a buildup of as many as 15,000 American troops in the region just over the last couple months. And the operation, it appears, was a military success from a narrowly strategic perspective, right? It succeeded in capturing Maduro. Apparently, the CIA had cooperation from within the Maduro regime in locating him, and it was conducted without American casualties. So success in both those respects. Apparently, there are some injuries to American troops. There are casualties in Venezuela. We don't know the extent of those casualties yet, but it does appear that it was a substantial military attack, not only on the Fuerte Tijuana military complex, but on other military facilities within the country. In part, I suspect, to send the message to the military of Venezuela that we can strike you, and so you had better cooperate with us. So the questions I have coming out of this, the first is, will this destabilize Venezuela, right? And the idea that, right, this is already a fragile society, a society in deep economic decline, a society that has apparently 8 million refugees in primarily the Americas right now, where internal repression is a substitute for legitimacy, where the considerable agricultural and mineral resources of the society are not being used to generate broad wealth for the society. It has, in other words, many of the hallmarks of a regime that can be destabilized and could collapse into civil war. There are forces backed by Colombia that might want to do that, or alternatively into a failed state. And so one possibility then is exactly the opposite of what the United States would hope for, a rapid change to a friendlier regime. Notoriously, we have learned in Latin America in the 1960s and 1970s, in the Middle East in the first decades of this century, that regime change is much more difficult than regime destruction. And then the alternative possibility that I think is worth weighing is that this invasion will strengthen the current regime, and in particular, resistance to what I'm calling naked American imperialism, which certainly is, when you hear Donald Trump's description of it, what this appears to be. We don't like your leaders. We don't like the way he's nationalized the country's oil reserves. We want you to take a different direction and to be more open to our extraction of your resources. And we have greater military power. And so we are going to use it to impose our will on your society, right? That seems to be the message of the President of the United States in the immediate aftermath of this invasion. And by the way, that's a message that will likely get the hackles up of many ordinary Venezuelans who may not be particularly supportive of this regime, but are obviously reluctant to accept American occupation, particularly when it's justified primarily in terms of American economic interests. So that's one range of questions, right? What happens in Venezuela? How destabilized will it be? How much of a military presence will we need to have in order to restabilize it? Could this be another quagmire? Right? Donald Trump promises that it won't, that he's a different kind of president. But the reason we have quagmires, the reason we end up involved in Afghanistan for 20 years without, in fact, bringing about successful regime change is not merely the managerial failures of the president or the American military or the regimes with which we're working on the ground. It's that regime change is extraordinarily difficult to do in complex societies, that it is a classic example of what James Scott calls seeing like a state, to believe that this is an engineering or managerial problem as opposed to an incredibly complex political problem. One of the ideas that I think needs to be always emphasized to students of politics in general is the so-called law of unintended consequences. When you act in politics, you can control your action, but you cannot control the reaction to your action. The bigger the action, the greater the likelihood that the reaction will be different from what you anticipate it to be. Your action is mediated by the intentions, ideas, interests, and emotions of other people. And especially as those transmit across a mass of other people, as they spread through the contagion of ideas and emotion, it is impossible to manage that sequence, that chain of events, in the way that you might be able to manage a classic engineering problem in a natural environment.
We went
Um,
and founded that.
Let's see. So I'm getting
Looks
a
like that
little
would be
background
Monday, Henry.
noise,
Yeah, hard to.
and I don't think I can mute. Let me see if I can. Um, did I mute? Looks like I did. It looks like only now Cheryl's microphone is on, if I've got it right, in addition, I hope, to my microphone. Um, so you are hearing me, I'm guessing. I'm hoping. I'm trying to see my own icon, but I can't. But it looks like you're able to hear me. So let me continue. The law of unintended consequences suggests that we don't have any idea what's going to happen in Venezuela. And it does appear that there's a stunning level of incaution. That the idea that we will be able to dictate how the people of Venezuela, the government of Venezuela, reacts to what we have just done is borderline magical thinking. And it does, frankly, smack of desperation, a desperation on the part of the President of the United States to be more in control of the attention surrounding him. He is masterful at capturing attention. He seems to have really taken to heart the old maxim that there is no such thing as bad publicity. But frankly, over the last couple months, as his approval rating has tanked, as the news about him has primarily focused on his apparent incompetence in managing the American economy, the idea that Donald Trump has been eager to find ways to attract positive attention to aspects of his leadership that shows him in the way that he wants to be viewed as strong, decisive, powerful, dominant, right? And so I think Pete Hegseth really captured it when he says the president intends to dominate the Western Hemisphere. The president has had a very hard time the last couple of months dominating American politics, right? Dominating the American economy. Frankly, we don't especially like dominance. He's looking for another theater in which he thinks maybe dominance will be easier to perform or actually obtain. I'm not sure Venezuela is the right theater. So, second question, how much will this attack affect international order and law? Right? And I just, was joking about another country pointing to Donald Trump and saying he's a criminal and corrupt. But please note that this is what societies all over the world throughout history do when they want a pretext to invade their neighbors or change the regime. So I would suggest to you that Vladimir Putin must be looking at what happened this morning and saying to himself, well, if Trump can do that to Venezuela, why shouldn't I try to do that in Ukraine, right? Why shouldn't I go after Vladimir Zelensky? Or, right, President Xi in China may be thinking the same thing about Taiwan, right? That the United States, which has traditionally served to bolster the norms and institutions of international law, has now revealed itself to want to return to late 19th, early 20th century lawless regime of international anarchy. Does that not open the door for other societies to say, in our backyard, we too will do what we want? Go ahead, the United States. You figure out what you can do with Venezuela. We're going to figure out what we can do with Taiwan, Ukraine, etc. And I think, the question of whether or not our allies will support us is, in a sense, irrelevant to the Trump decision making process. But I do think the question of whether or not um, American allies increasingly look at the United States and say to themselves, at least under the leadership of Donald Trump, but maybe for the foreseeable future, this is not the America with whom we have accords, partnerships, relationships, trusts. And I will note, as I've noted to you before, one of, I think, the really important lessons of the history of international relationships is treaties are by themselves not particularly reliable or valuable. It's not a contract in a domestic legal realm where, right, violation of the contract leads to enforcement of the contract by a court and eventually by the state, the police, etc. There's coercion working in the background to keep the parties adherent to the terms of their contracts. Treaties, right, depend upon the goodwill and the follow through of the signatories to the treaties. There is no general global state working in the background to enforce the treaty. And that means that the trustworthiness, the particular relationship between the signatories to the treaty matters greatly to the strength and the reliance on the treaty, and that more and more of our hitherto allies may be looking at the United States and saying, well, if they do this unilaterally, if they do this in ways that are likely to destabilize the international order on which we rely, is the United States really the kind of partner that we think it is, that we have a relationship with, that we can rely on and trust? Or do we have to pull back, reconsider, and think about reconstituting our alliances so that the United States is less central and important to those alliances? So, right, the question of whether or not bad actors will be encouraged to engage in similar aggression, whether or not U.S. allies may be reconsidering the United States, another big question coming out of this. Third question, right? A new indictment of Nicolás Maduro and his wife was revealed earlier this morning. I have not come up to speed with it, but I gather that the core accusation is that he is a narco-terrorist and that he has reconstituted Venezuela to be a narco-terrorist regime. And so Maduro is currently, right, in handcuffs and a blindfold on an American ship, but soon to be transported to New York, where he will be indicted in court and where there will eventually be a trial. Will the United States be able to secure a conviction of Nicolás Maduro? And here I will note two things immediately. The first is, of course, that the full resources and power of the Justice Department and associate agencies within the federal government will be put to the task of securing that conviction. And so it will be perhaps a lopsided battle. But on the other hand, that this administration does not have a good record at securing the conviction of the people that it targets for political prosecution. And I think we should be clear. This is exactly that kind of case. And that when we look at the details of the allegation, it appears, yes, there are certainly corrupt people in the Maduro administration who, for instance, work with Colombian or Mexican cartels. But the question of whether or not there is evidence that Maduro himself is directly involved in or directing that corruption, as opposed to permitting or tolerating but not directly participating in, I think is something that we will have to see what kind of evidence there is. But I do not think it's a slam dunk or a fait accompli that the conviction of Maduro will be secured. And it raises the ugly possibility that the United States will have invaded and destabilized, right, another country to bring its leader to the United States to stand trial, and that there's a possibility that it may all be for naught if the conviction is not secured. Moving into American politics, the last two questions I'm going to raise have to do with the domestic reception of this. The first is, right, will this help to restore Donald Trump's popularity and initiative? And of course, I think the answer to that question cannot be separated from the questions about what happens in Venezuela. If this turns into a protracted, difficult, expensive occupation where the outcome is not what we had hoped for, then it seems unlikely that in the long term it will redound to Donald Trump's benefit. But in the short term, right, the optics of success, of decisiveness, of strength, of muscular military action are all right delivered by this. How much does that help Donald Trump in the absence of greater economic success domestically? And again, I'm just not sure, but if history is a lesson, it suggests that for the most part, the American people is not easily distracted from domestic woes by foreign expeditions, right? And so although I understand the desire to change the narrative around his presidency and that the right potential of a successful foreign military operation seems to right have some of the attributes that domestic action lacks, right? Donald Trump wanted to go into the cities and quickly attack the enemy within and turn things around. Well, that is not how it's worked out with the deportation operations, right? You know, a lot of people have been deported, fewer people are coming, but by the way, if you destabilize Venezuela, watch out for the potential tidal wave of refugees that will inundate neighboring societies, potentially destabilize them, and then eventually, I have little doubt, wash up or try to wash up on the American border as well. Final question about this. Is this legal? Right? And I think under international law, the answer is quite clear, and the answer has been clear not only with regard to right the blowing up of the boats in the Caribbean, but now also with the effort to invade in order to bring about regime change. This is not what international law permits. This is a major violation of international law. And then domestically, right? The idea that there is no authorization for this from Congress is perhaps, as Donald Trump seemed to suggest in his call to Fox News earlier today, a kind of procedural nicety. Here's what he said, right? That the Democrats who were raising the issues of the constitutionality in the absence of congressional authorization of the U.S. invading another country were weak, stupid people. They should say, great job. They shouldn't say, oh, gee, maybe it's not constitutional. You know, the same old stuff that we've been hearing for years and years and years. And this is Donald Trump attempting to occupy the place of the strongman leader who says those constitutional niceties may have worked in the 18th century when we were a backwater little country, but in the 21st century as a superpower, we are going to act in dominant ways and not be restricted by the constitutional architecture of, right, 250 years ago. But having said that, let me just point out, right, that part of the consequence of this, it very much echoes what we talked about last week, that Donald Trump owns the economy because he has acted unilaterally, exclusively through executive action. He did not make the case to Congress that there is a legal or a strategic imperative that we do this. He simply ordered his administration to carry out this plan. And so, as a matter of procedure and law, this is unconstitutional and lacking in legality. As a matter of politics, if anything goes wrong, as I've suggested, there's a high likelihood that it will, Donald Trump will own this expedition in the same way that he increasingly owns the economy. So let us assume for a second, and I'll just talk this through, that all of this goes as well as can be imagined, right? Um, let's assume that miraculously, within a year or two, the Venezuelan petroleum infrastructure is rebuilt and functioning in a highly efficient way. Let us assume that the result is that it brings down the price of oil globally. It doesn't just line the pockets of Donald Trump's friends and cronies, the people who contributed hundreds of millions of dollars to get him elected from the petroleum industry, but it also redounds to the benefit of the American and the global economy because, of course, the price of oil is baked into the price of almost all other consumer goods. Does Donald Trump get a big boost from this? And that is, in a sense, where I want to come back to the focus on domestic economics. Because it's not clear to me, right? Even if everything goes exactly as Donald Trump wishes, that this ultimately addresses the economic problems of the United States. I will just very quickly return to the national security strategy that Trump and his administration published in 2025. We've looked at this together before. We have looked at the guest essay in the New York Times that suggested that Trump's strategy is putting us on a path to world war. That strategy, right, that analysis of the strategy suggested that by pivoting back to the Western Hemisphere, the United States was taking its eyes off of, its troops out of, its focus away from Asia and Europe, and that these are the regions that pose the largest threat for war. And now we see, right? I think that when we looked at this document in November, it wasn't entirely clear how much of it was rhetorical, how much of it was actually going to be the basis for foreign policy. But I think we would be well advised to take seriously that the Trump administration has begun not just to pivot, but a major reorientation of American foreign policy when it says we want to ensure that the Western Hemisphere remains reasonably stable and well governed enough to prevent and discourage mass migration to the United States. We want a hemisphere whose governments cooperate with us against narco-terrorist cartels and other transnational criminal organizations. We want a hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursions or ownership of key assets. And please note, right, both China and Russia have big interests in Venezuela. And so how this affects our relations with those countries is very much up for grabs. And I'm sorry, we want to ensure our continued access to key strategic locations. In other words, we will assert and enforce a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. To be as clear as possible, the Monroe Doctrine is a 19th century imperial doctrine, right? And the idea that the United States in the 21st century, in this era of vast global interconnectivity, of drones and drone warfare, and new instruments that seem to level the playing field between the big powers and the small powers, but also of economic and environmental and health interdependence, and of a series of institutions, treaties, and initiatives designed to both further that interdependence and manage it. That the United States is going to just throw all of that away and return to 19th century imperial power politics, well, it will certainly destabilize these institutions. But I'm not sure that it can undo the degree of global interdependence. As a matter of fact, I remain highly skeptical about that. All right, so that's my initial thinking about the news we all awoke to. Give you the opportunity to think aloud, to raise whatever questions or concerns you have before I move into, if time permits, the other topic for today. Anybody feel like talking this through at this point? What strikes you as John? Go right ahead.
I subscribe to your whole analysis, but I do think it's worth pointing out, since very often on this lecture and elsewhere we've spoken about the not just the immorality but the incompetence of the Trump administration. That you have to give them credit. It would seem to me this seems to have been pulled off about as well as could be, and that has not been true of all of America's, military. It's certainly too soon to say, but on previous things, it seems to have been done very well. I mean, if you're going to do it well anyway. Don't screw it up.
Yeah, and it does appear we had good intelligence, we had good military planning, and by the way, it also appears that we, although it was perhaps obvious to the Venezuelan regime and military that we had a huge presence in the region, that we managed to hide the timing of this quite well until it was actually upon them. So yes, and I do think that military leadership as well as leadership within the administration gets credit for doing this well, right? And whether or not that will ultimately be something they want to take credit for 2 years from now, we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, I agree with you, John. I tried to emphasize, right, that this was successful in the sense that it achieved its mission. And by the way, it did so without any American casualties. We don't know what the casualties were on the ground. And go ahead.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One, as far as achieving it successfully, we don't know what its goal was, so we don't know if it's successful or not. If it was just to capture Maduro, they did that, period. But that's a small part of what's going on.
Yeah,
Venezuela is a big country.
yeah,
Another one was that our administration acting like a bunch of teenage boys who got together to decide on let's try this, let's do this. This will be such fun, without any idea of consequences. And then the third thing that came to my mind was, okay, we went into Venezuela. How soon is China going to take over Taiwan?
yeah, yeah.
I
So
mean, why should any other country be constrained in any way? I think we just loosed a beast that the world will be changed forever.
yeah, and I'm not sure we're alone or exclusively initiating this, right? You know,
Yeah,
Putin
we don't know that. Yeah.
Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the nature of the Israeli response in, to Hamas in Gaza, the bombing of the Iranian nuclear facility, right? The growing frequency of the violation of territorial sovereignty and the rules of international law and war. It seems to me to be a feature of the last decade. Some of this may have to do with the first Trump administration. Some of it may have to do with the general perception that these institutions are weak and fragile, the institutions of international order. But yes, I agree with your last point entirely. On your first point, what were the objectives of this mission? And I don't know if there was any pivoting on the ground away from other objectives. But it does seem to me that one objective that is obvious and that we will have to see how it worked or didn't work was to, if you will, drive a wedge between the Venezuelan military and the regime, right? The current government of Venezuela, right? With the vice president now having been sworn in as the president, someone who was appointed by Maduro and is a right adherent to his basic ideology, philosophy, another left-wing populist, someone who presumably wouldn't cooperate very much with American extraction of resources from Venezuela. So, right, the idea that the United States wants the current regime of Venezuela to believe that its military may not either engage in domestic repression or defense of Venezuela against further American incursions, unless the regime of Venezuela cooperates with Donald Trump. That's a second objective, and that's not a military objective. That's a political objective, right? And so we'll just have to wait and see. Your second point, you say it's a bunch of teenage boys. I will say more or less I agree with you, and that I think that Donald Trump is someone who throughout his life, whatever the problem is, whatever the context is, has always tried to impose his will via the use of superior power, whether that is monetary or military, right? And that he has surrounded himself with people who subscribe to this worldview, that the fact that our public sphere and the media system that carries it has been transformed into an echo chamber system in which people who want to act this way, want to believe that the world responds in this way to their power and violence, now see that mirrored back to them in Fox News and various chat rooms across social media, that this is part of what is sustaining this administration in its capacity to rely on magical thinking. And what is, I think, maybe scariest about all of this is the way in which this failed so abysmally in the first year of the Trump administration, right, of 2025. And yet, rather than correcting course, this seems to be a kind of either doubling down or just searching for the right environment where the optics of strength and agency, of military masculinity will work. And they seem to think it's going to work better in Venezuela than it did in Chicago or Portland. I am highly skeptical of that. But they live in their echo chamber, both within the administration and within the media system. And so they're not getting any correction on these bad ideas. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, can you hear me? I can't tell
That's
if I'm
fine,
muted.
yes.
Yeah. That, and this is not really new, it's just a different read on what you and John and Ann have been talking about. Seems to me that this is sort of the last straw for the United Nations and previous attempts to have a sort of a world order and a respect for the notion of sovereignty. But it also seems to me that by our entering into this kind of action, that we have failed to that we're leaving the kind of I guess political ideology or philosophy that dominated the United Nations thinking of NATO, Europe, and the United States, and we're joining in with the bad guys, China and Russia and that crew, and that basically we decided, well, if they can play this game, then so can we. But now, if we can play this game, so can any other formerly nation formerly aligned with like the NATO alliance and the like. So we basically created a kind of a, as Ann said, a license for anyone to do this, and that just scares the hell out of me.
Yeah, and so I don't have much to add. I'll say maybe two things quickly. One of them is yes, Donald Trump has made it clear and surrounded himself with people. And by the way, large portions of the American elite, right? The corporate elite, the wealthiest individuals have supported him, right? Have funneled hundreds of millions of dollars into Project 2025 to outline in meticulous detail the legal strategy to allow Donald Trump to become a strongman leader, right? A Viktor Orban for the United States, and strongmen ideally, or the prototype, have strength not only domestically but internationally and are willing to use that strength. But so Donald Trump clearly fancies himself in this mold and wants to exercise this kind of power. And we're really seeing, right, that the America First agenda, Marjorie Taylor Greene saying that Donald Trump has gotten distracted, and right, Donald Trump saying to the Atlantic magazine in an interview, America First means what I say it means, right? This is not the president who is going to focus all his efforts on the American economy, who came to power in part in his party as a result of deep disillusionment with George W. Bush and with the pivot of the Bush administration away from rebuilding the American economy and the American working class and into these expeditions in Afghanistan and Iraq, that Donald Trump seems to be increasingly moving in this direction as well. And then to your second comment, David, that this is the death blow to the United Nations system, the system of international law and norms and treaty organizations, the system that has produced the degree of global integration that we see in the 21st century. I'll say two things to this. I think the first is that the high watermark of global integration was probably a decade ago, and that we've been seeing movement away from it, particularly economically, already, right? And that COVID accelerated this sense that we need to near shore or friend shore, that we need to really be careful that our supply chains are resilient and reliable even in moments of international crisis, right? So that's been going on for a while. The counter to that, and I think it's just worthwhile noticing, right? What produces international institutions, right? And all of this, right, web of international norms and treaties and right, the effort to have a global regulatory regime that stops short of being a state, but nevertheless creates a fair bit of order. And I would suggest what
United Nations
is the degree of international independence that we encounter in the 21st century. And I don't think that's going away, whether it's climate change or artificial intelligence or the rapid spread of pathogens as a result of the number of human beings and the degree of the mobility of our populations, whether it's refugees, right, or the incredible wealth, but also deep fragility of the international economy, right? These seem to be permanent features of society going forward, right? We've spoken in the past about global society. We really seem to have global society in the 21st century, and the technology that creates it, whether it's cargo ships or airplanes or the internet or artificial intelligence or social media, is not going away. It's woven into the very fabric of our existence. And so I'm not sure that this is the death knell for international institutions. It certainly is a low moment. It certainly is going to weaken and destabilize them for the next 3 years. But I'm not sure that there aren't structural forces that are going to lead to us having to rebuild them once that damage is done. So, long picture, I hope, might be a little bit different from the short-term picture. Did you want to come back on that at all, David?
No, I think your point is well taken about the other forces of globalization that have evolved with technology in one way, shape, or form. But that still leaves open the question of the destruction of the principles of sovereignty and the really, if you will, respecting the democratic will of all countries.
Yeah.
That seems to be very much in jeopardy.
Territorial integrity looks like it's on life support in
Yeah.
2025, 2026. I want to say one more thing very quickly that you put me in mind of, and then Flossie, I'll come to you. I see you've got your hand up and you're unmuted, so I'll come to you quickly. I'm going to be really curious to see what the Republican reaction in Congress is to this, right? Do the Republicans just roll over and endorse this, or is there some substantial pushback against this? I think that will, in part, tell us about the health of our domestic institutions, which I think is very low right now. But does it maybe, in fact, get a little bit of encouragement from the lawlessness of this action? Flossie, go ahead.
Will the
Oh, you took your hand off, Flossie. Now I can't hear you. Got to put it
will,
back. There you go. There you go.
will the Venezuelan people themselves turn over and die? Won't there be some kind of exodus from Venezuela? And the Venezuelan people aren't all dopes or peons. Some of them are well-educated people. I knew some of them at UC Berkeley. They were aristocrats. They had double names. They could speak English beautifully. They were smart. They were rich. I don't think that they're going to accept what has happened to them with, okay, that's life. There's going to be something happening in Venezuela. I'm waiting to see.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Flossie. And I'll just add, it is a fractured society, right? The figure I hear is that there are 8 million Venezuelan refugees outside of Venezuela right now. That's a huge number, right? And then right unfortunately, I think in a deeply fractured society, when you destabilize the regime, the result is not necessarily that a better regime comes into power, right? And so yes, I think there's going to be a lot of pushback, a lot of rallying around the regime in light of the American violation of sovereignty, the abduction of their president, the expressed desire for ongoing presence in their economy and society, running their most valuable resources, right? But it's also the case that I worry that eventually half this society doesn't want this regime in power. The other half seems to want it in power, that there are deep vested interests in the military and in the petroleum oligarchs in keeping, right, this regime in power, but also lots of people who want to see regime change, that these are the conditions that tend to lead to instability, and that we may just have, right, pulled card out from a house of cards. So I don't know what happens in Venezuela going forward. We will have to wait and see. All right. So I think, we did what Donald Trump wanted us to do. We took our eyes off the economy and we paid all our attention to Venezuela. I think it was productive and important that we do so. We are, alas, out of time. So rather than trying to launch into another topic, if there aren't any other comments or thoughts for today, I will say Happy New Year. I will say be well. And I will say I look forward to actually talking with you about abundance, affordability, and well being in the American economy in the 21st century next week. See everybody soon. Take care, guys. All right.
Thank you, David.
Of course. Thank you, Jonathan. Bye bye, everybody.
Right.